All right, welcome to SCI TV. Today, I am really happy to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Jonathan Mills. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's great to be here. Been a
So
long
we've known
time
each other
coming.
for a long time,
Yeah, sure
and
have.
we've had some opportunity to work together in different capacities. What I want to do a little bit is introduce you to some of our audience here today, and maybe you can give a little background leading up to where are some of the things that prepared you for the work you do at Core Performance. We could even shadow a little bit of how you partner with Sports Conflict Institute as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we got to know each other in my undergrad when I was at University of Oregon studying sports business and started my career on that trajectory of working in data and analytics on the business side of professional sports. So I was with Harris Blitzer Sports and Entertainment for 6 years, 76ers and Devils. And COVID hit, and like with a lot of people, that kind of changed my career trajectory. My life was sort of in flux, like it was for so many, and I decided to go back to school and uh, pursue another passion in addition to sports business, which was sports psychology. So I went to the University of Denver to do my master's in sport and performance psychology to work with athletes on the mental side of their game. So helping improve performance through mental skills training. And through that, ended up starting a private practice in mental performance consulting with two other classmates there. And we started Core Mental Performance, which is my private practice here that work with athletes virtually all over the country, working on mental skills training. And that is sort of what led us to connecting again all these years later.
Yeah, it's a great background, and I appreciate that you bring in both that pragmatic side of understanding the business of sport and why performance matters so much, but then also really your passion point. So I was hoping maybe you could talk a bit more about what drove you beyond a pandemic, creating a little
Right.
wake-up call, but what drove you to really find your why, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about where that passion is and where it comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like so many of those who work in sports and pursue sports as a passion, as a career, many were athletes themselves. And that was the case for me. I was a basketball player growing up and definitely had some of my own sort of mental challenges being sort of an undersized kid in small town Southern Oregon. I was pretty anxious as a high school athlete. And I think it was always in the back of my mind that working with sports psychologist or mental skills training was something that was on my radar that existed, but I didn't know a lot about it. And uh, my mother was a figure skating coach who incorporated some mental skills training into her coaching, and that kind of opened my eyes to this field. And um, I realized that I wanted to help others who may have had similar experiences that I did with the mental challenges of being an athlete and overcoming those and helping people felt like my calling and something that was very personal to me and felt like a really good opportunity and the right time to go back to that interest and follow that passion to work with others to overcome some of the challenges that I had as a younger athlete.
I think one of the passion points we both share is that neither of us see sport as trivial.
Right,
That in
right.
fact, we think it's actually pretty important. And here we are at a
Yeah,
time where the world's pretty divided. And yet sport tends to be the place where we get to come together and grow in fairly profound ways.
absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about some of that work you do with athletes and how you keep them in their opportunity and preserve their opportunity through some of the work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. And initially, that was sort of through the business side of helping people experience the world of sports from a fan perspective, and sort of on the other side of that is the athlete experience. And I've always believed that athletes are human beings first, and so sort of grounding the work that we do at Core Mental Performance in who an athlete or performer is as a person, being sort of the primary and really grounding that in values is a lot of the work that we do of why do you play your sport, exploring the why of something that is transferable beyond the court or field, um, whether that is representing a community or family, or maybe there's personality traits that an athlete has that they can't really access in everyday life. Aggression, maybe that's something that actually is really productive on the court of play, but isn't really accessible in other aspects of life. So sort of exploring what is important to an individual athlete for who they want to be, and using those values as sort of a compass to unlock some of pursuing personal growth and development as an athlete and as a person.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. When I look at attrition out of sport, there's pretty clear indicators of what knocks people out of sport. And really, two of the biggest categories are mental health, mental well-being, that
Yeah.
category, which is a lane you play in pretty prominently, and the
Yeah.
other is conflict with others. So I think about that
Right.
interpersonal and intrapersonal
Right.
conflict as sort
Yeah.
of two main barriers for people retaining their passion and retaining their opportunities around sport.
Totally. I love that framework of sort of the interpersonal and intrapersonal. I think back to class in undergrad that you taught of sports conflict and teams and overcoming some of those barriers, and that definitely was formative in sort of the way I think about facilitating group sessions now too, in addition to individual athletes, working on team cohesion and communication and some of that stuff that gets in the way intrapersonally or interpersonally. Yeah.
Yeah, so as you've been pursuing your education, you kind of have these two really interesting lanes, right, that you've been playing in. One is that more traditional sport performance side, and then
Mhm.
the other is more of the clinical
Right.
psychology
Right.
side.
Yeah.
Can you talk about both how they're different and in some ways how they're the same or play off
Yeah.
each other a bit?
Absolutely. I love that question. And I think that the public generally isn't super well versed in sort of where those lines are. And often we think about sports psychology or working with athletes as just being sort of one thing. And in reality, there is a lot of crossover, but they are sort of two distinct fields. And so my master's training and what I do with core mental performance is all about, yes, extending off of the court or field to pursue values, but really grounded in sports performance and elevating as an athlete. Concurrently, I'm pursuing my doctoral training in clinical psychology to become a licensed psychologist to treat overall mental health and well-being. And what we see and what we've found in recent years is that a lot of athletes struggle off the court, off the field with mental health diagnoses and clinical issues that in turn end up affecting their performance as an athlete. And so maximizing mental wellness actually is conducive to improving performance as well, though it is sort of a separate role, right? We have people who are specialized in self talk and confidence, goal setting, those sorts of performance issues, as opposed to treating somebody with complex trauma or untreated depression, anxiety, that affects somebody as a human being above and beyond their identity as an athlete.
And I imagine as an athlete, the athlete cares a little less about that line, just wants some support and help and the ability to really get back to focusing on where their passion lies, right? And so
Absolutely.
I think combining the two is pretty brilliant from my
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. And that definitely was the inspiration for me to be able to treat both performance and mental health and work with an athlete on whatever comes through the door, as opposed to having to sort of refer to a mental health professional who's licensed to treat mental health stuff, because they really are overlapping so often. And I think about somebody like Tyrese Halliburton, who was just in the NBA Finals, spoke out about his mental health struggles that were really affecting him early on in this season. Fast forward to tearing his Achilles, likely being out for a whole season now, and the mental health challenges that might come from injury recovery and being a human being, and that moment of agony that we saw on the court of heartbreak, and how overcoming that ultimately will set him up for a successful return to the court and being the best version of himself as a player, in addition to a healthy human being.
Yeah, it's funny. We talk so much about, strength training in sport and most people assume the physical side of that. But in some ways, the type of resilience you're talking about and the adaptation you're talking about from mental strength and mental well-being may matter more,
Yeah,
right? For the success of folks. So lots of people could be physical specimen, but
right.
if they can't manage all of that that they have on life and the things swirling around inside their head, whether they're clinical or not, I
Hmm.
imagine it's quite the challenge for many athletes.
Totally. And I think there is a lot of cliches about how sports are 90% mental, 10% physical, whatever balance you want to put on it. And the reality is, no matter what number breakdown, there's no way the typical athlete is spending that amount of time on the mental side of the game in training outside. So wherever that line is, that balance of physical versus mental, trying to implement more mental training, clinical and performance, uh, to balance out sort of the amount of time you're spending on your physical body. We don't really think about going to the gym for our mind, and that's like you highlight, just as important, or even maybe more important in some cases.
Yeah, not to bring it too far back into your roots in sport, but
Yeah.
is this the next money ball in sport to really be able to optimize folks' mental resilience, mental capacity, mental well-being?
I think there's something to that. There's certainly an aspect of analytics that in player personnel decision making, trying to quantify some of those intangible human elements is sort of an ongoing question of how feasible is that? What measures can we use um, to track some of that stuff? And is there an edge there? Again, bringing it back to the NBA Finals and looking at the two teams that were just there, the Pacers and the Thunder were both very well connected, cohesive teams that genuinely seemed to like being around each other. And countless stories that came out of that finals about how important some of the character pieces were in building those rosters. And so I do think there's a competitive advantage and financial incentive to teams to keep athletes healthy mentally and connecting in a productive way
Yeah,
to maximize their talents.
I appreciate hearing that because a lot of times when I think about it, even through the lens of conflict resolution,
Mhm.
that it's a nice answer to say that we're doing right by someone and doing the right thing. And I believe strongly in a lot of the processes I have some expertise
Mhm.
in, mediation, arbitration, et cetera. But it's a lot more compelling if I can say not only is it the right thing, but it's really good business too.
Yeah,
And my sense
absolutely.
is that you're in the same space that while of course you believe in it wholeheartedly for the good of the human,
Mhm.
that it also is good business if you care about performance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is on the individual level of pursuing dreams to accomplish things that an athlete has wanted their whole life, and that comes with accolades and financial success and generational wealth to change families' livelihoods. And so, on an individual level and for a team, it really is in the best interest to make sure that some of those interpersonal and interpersonal conflicts are getting in the way of that, like you described.
How do you deal with the fact that so many athletes really are by definition outliers? And
Right.
I'm sure when you're applying the DSM, that's part of the litmus test to try and find outliers, but figure out what to do. But if you have unending belief in yourself in the face of objective data that says your dreams are probably not going to happen, right? The
Mhm.
number of folks that are going to make their sport, their profession is always going to be quite low, but you have to believe before you
Mhm.
transition out right into the last moment that you could accomplish something, right? How do you deal
Yeah.
with that kind of outlier personality that's so unique to sport?
Yeah, I think that's a great question that I'd love to explore further and do some more research on, because it is a kind of a fine line, sticky situation of some of what makes these athletes so great is their competitiveness and their will to win and the Mamba mentality type of thing that maybe isn't conducive always to healthy living or healthy thinking. And from a DSM perspective, it's always about sort of clinically significant distress and impairment. And so I just think about these outliers who maybe are within a normal range for their own cognitive abilities of how far they can push that isn't actually causing impairment or distress. And when it crosses over, that's where it might go from being a strength for an individual, an athlete, to actually a hindrance. And so I love that question of how do we identify that? How do we catch that? How can we promote these athletes who are totally outliers in the way that they think and act to achieve great things while still protecting them from themselves, maybe sometimes.
And historically, we've had a bit of a stigma
Mm-hmm.
around talking openly about mental health, mental well-being, especially in sport,
Yeah.
where the old slap a band-aid on it. And
Mm-hmm.
even using your Halliburton example, here as an individual who the medical advice would be maybe you don't play these last couple of games because your calf muscle is so weak, and we know that often these lead to the type of catastrophic Achilles injuries that in fact happened, but we
Mm-hmm.
reward and celebrate that kind of toughen it out. But as you
Yeah.
know, mental health isn't always a place where you can just tough it out. You
Mm-hmm.
need support, and it's as much a clinical issue as a broken bone is.
Right.
How are we dealing with this stigma? And I'll give you a little vignette before I let you answer.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
was sitting in the NBA offices with a previous commissioner who really hated the idea that someone would ever speak openly about mental
Mm-hmm.
health, and picked on in particular Delonte West, who's famously dealt with
Yeah.
significant mental health issues that really truncated his career and has now left his life in disarray, where he's
Yeah.
as I understood, out in the street somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
with people trying to help when they can.
Yeah.
Obviously, we moved on from that attitude a bit,
Mm-hmm.
but are we where we need to be, and what work still remains in this space?
Yeah. It's certainly compared to the David Stern era of the NBA, there is a lot more awareness and openness among players, and every team now is required to have a licensed psychologist on staff, a licensed clinical provider. And so there certainly is more acceptance internally. And the reality is it isn't where it needs to be, because there is still stigma around player selection for a roster, uh, in the locker room, potential risks of sort of what fear of what teammates might think about speaking openly about that um, aspect of somebody's life. And I like to think that we're further along in the acceptance and decreased stigma than maybe where we were, but certainly a long way to go to try to frame this again in the lens of like performance enhancement, that there's a reason these people are required to be on staff, because they can help you. This is a resource that shouldn't be frowned upon and viewed as a weakness. And there's also some sort of player association resources outside of teams, I know, so that if players are worried about that stigma, they still have access to resources. And so just trying to provide as many levels of support wherever an athlete can find it. And the more and more players speak out about the success and help that they've had, we've seen some great Players Tribune articles of athletes talking about successes of working with a sports psychologist or seeking help from a licensed provider, that I think goes a long way in tackling that stigma.
That's great. Well, as we wrap this first conversation, anything
Yeah.
else that you'd want folks to know about you, about why you do this work, and what you're hoping to do in the years ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm midway through my doctoral training right now, and so I'm doing some mindfulness workshops with college student athletes right now. I'm collecting some data around athletic identity, how strong and pervasive sort of that role of being an athlete is in an individual's life, how that connects to perfectionism, of sort of striving to be nothing but the best, a little bit like we were just talking about, and ultimately how that can lead to anxiety, clinical anxiety outside of performance. That's what I'm working on right now as a potential dissertation project. Hopefully, some published research coming out of that down the road. Ultimately, with the goal of becoming a licensed psychologist working with college or professional athletes in my career, in addition to the work we're going to do together with Sports Conflict Institute and Core Mental Performance. So, a lot of exciting stuff to come, and school never ends for me.
Well, that's
lifelong
great.
learner.
Yeah, you're always going to be learning, so I don't think you should ever hang that part of yourself up on a shelf
Yeah.
anywhere. Well, thank you so much. I'm really
Yeah.
thrilled that you are part of the Sports Conflict Institute family. The work that you're doing individually and through core performance are outstanding, and we'll all be better off for your involvement. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's an honor to be involved.